Imagine a quiet library, a place meant for knowledge and refuge. A young homeless girl steps inside, her clothes tattered but her eyes filled with hope. She's not looking for trouble, just a warm corner and maybe a chance to escape her harsh reality for a moment. But instead of kindness, the librarian greets her with cold stares and harsh words, ordering her to leave. The girl, humiliated, turns to go, but fate has other plans. Just as the scene unfolds, none other than Morgan Freeman walks in. Yes, Morgan Freeman, with his commanding presence and a voice that can silence any room. The library freezes. People watch, stunned, as he steps in between the girl and the librarian. A calm yet firm expression on his face. What happens next will leave everyone in that room, and you absolutely speechless. This is a story of compassion, courage, and how one bold act from a legendary figure reminds us all of the power of kindness. Stay with us as we reveal how Morgan Freeman's extraordinary gesture changes everything for this young girl and teaches a lesson the world won't soon forget. You won't believe how this story unfolds. The librarian stood frozen, unsure of how to respond as Morgan Freeman gently stepped closer. His calm demeanor didn't hide the sharpness in his eyes as he looked at the woman, then at the trembling girl clutching a worn backpack. The silence in the room was thick, the other patrons too stunned to move. The girl, barely a teenager, lowered her gaze, her face red with embarrassment. Morgan broke the silence with a question that stopped everyone in their tracks. Why does she have to leave? His voice was soft but firm, each word cutting through the tension. The librarian fumbled for an answer, muttering something about policy and rules, but her words sounded weak even to her. The girl finally looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. She opened her mouth to explain herself, but seemed too overwhelmed to speak. The room held its breath. Who was this girl? What brought her here today? As the librarian stammered, Morgan turned his attention back to the girl. "What's your name?" he asked gently. For the first time, she met his eyes, and with a shaky voice, she replied, "Emily." Morgan nodded. "Well, Emily, let's see if we can find a way to make this library feel more like a home for everyone." The room buzzed with curiosity as he reached for something unexpected in his pocket. Emily's name seemed to linger in the air as Morgan Freeman looked around the library. People whispered among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable, others intrigued by what was unfolding. Emily clutched her backpack tighter, unsure whether to stay or run. She had only come in to find a moment of peace, but now all eyes were on her. Morgan pulled out a small notebook from his pocket, flipping through its pages thoughtfully. "Emily," he said, his voice as steady as ever, "what were you looking for here today?" She hesitated, glancing at the librarian, who still stood rigid, her lips pursed. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to read. To study. I'm trying to finish school on my own." The weight of her words hung in the room. A few heads turned, the whispers growing softer. But the librarian crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "This isn't a shelter," she said coldly. "We can't let just anyone come in and disrupt the space." Morgan didn't flinch. Instead, he turned back to Emily, his gaze filled with warmth and encouragement. "And how far have you gotten on your own?" he asked. Emily hesitated, then slowly unzipped her backpack. Inside were crumpled papers, old library books, and a dog-eared notebook full of handwritten notes. The sight of it silenced the room. But as Emily began to explain her story, a new voice suddenly spoke from the back of the library. A man stepped forward, his face unfamiliar to most, but his words carried a surprising weight. This library was built to help everyone in the community, no matter their circumstances. His presence shifted the energy in the room even further. Morgan turned to face the man, a glimmer of interest in his eyes. The tension between compassion and rules, between those who wanted to help and those who feared change, was far from over. The man who stepped forward introduced himself as a local teacher, someone who had spent years helping struggling students in the community. His voice was steady, but his words carried a quiet determination. "I've seen too many kids like Emily fall through the cracks," he said, looking around the room. "This library should be a place where people can rise up, not be pushed out." The librarian's face flushed, her grip tightening on the desk in front of her. "We have rules for a reason," she insisted. "If we make exceptions, where does it stop? This isn't about being heartless. It's about keeping order." Morgan took a step forward, his commanding presence filling the space. "Order is important," he agreed, "but humanity is more important." He turned back to Emily, who stood frozen in place, her eyes darting between him and the librarian. "You said you're trying to finish school," Morgan said. "Why?" Emily's voice cracked as she answered, "Because I want to be better. I don't want to stay stuck. I want a chance." Her words, simple but raw, sent a ripple through the room. Before anyone could respond, the teacher chimed in again. "I think we've all lost sight of what places like this are meant to be. Resources for the people who need them most. Why not let Emily stay and prove what she's capable of?" But not everyone in the library seemed convinced. A few patrons whispered harshly, agreeing with the librarian's stance. One woman spoke up from a nearby table, her voice sharp. "If we let one person bend the rules, others will follow. It's not fair to everyone else." The room grew tense, divided between compassion and fear of disruption. Morgan remained calm, his gaze sweeping the faces around him. He leaned slightly toward Emily and spoke softly, but his words carried. "Sometimes proving your worth isn't about convincing everyone. It's about holding on to what you believe in." As he stood beside her, it became clear this was no longer just about one girl and a librarian. It was a battle of perspectives, what a community is meant to stand for. The next move would decide everything. Before anyone could respond, the doors to the library creaked open again, and an older woman stepped inside, her expression serious. She carried herself with authority, dressed in a tailored coat, and walked straight toward the commotion. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people recognized her. She was the head of the library board. Her arrival sent a chill through the room, especially for the librarian, whose rigid stance faltered for the first time. "What's going on here?" the woman asked, her voice calm but firm, scanning the room. The librarian quickly stepped forward, gesturing to Emily. "This young girl was trying to stay here without permission," she explained, her tone defensive. "I was just enforcing policy, but things escalated." The board member's eyes narrowed slightly as she turned to Morgan Freeman, then Emily, and finally the teacher who had spoken earlier. "Escalated, you say?" she said, her tone sharper now. "What exactly is the problem here? This is a public library, is it not?" Morgan stepped forward, his calm authority meeting hers. "It is," he said evenly, "but there seems to be confusion about what public really means." He gestured toward Emily. "This young lady is just trying to learn, to grow, and yet she's being told she doesn't belong." The older woman's gaze softened for a moment, but her response was unexpected. "Rules exist for a reason," she said slowly, echoing the librarian's earlier sentiment. "But so does discretion. Let's not forget, this library operates under strict funding constraints." Her words sent a murmur through the room. People began questioning what she meant, and the stakes of the conversation suddenly shifted. The conflict wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about deeper issues, like how resources were allocated and who deserved access to them. Then, just as the tension seemed ready to boil over, Emily spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't want to take anything from anyone," she said, clutching her backpack. "I just wanted to borrow a little space and a chance." The board member hesitated, caught off guard by Emily's courage. But before she could respond, someone from the back of the room stood up, a young man in a library staff uniform. "If it's about funding," he said, his voice loud and clear, "maybe we should talk about where the money asterisk really asterisk goes in this place." The room went silent, all eyes now on him. Whatever he was about to reveal, it seemed certain to change everything. The room fell silent as the young staff member stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Most people don't know this," he began, "but a big chunk of our funding isn't even used for books or programs. It's tied up in things like administrative perks and unused renovations. Meanwhile, we cut corners on what really matters, helping people like her." He pointed toward Emily, who shrank slightly under the attention but held her ground. The board member's expression hardened, clearly caught off guard. "That's a serious claim," she said. "Do you have proof?" The staffer nodded, pulling out a folder from under his arm. "It's all here, budget reports, spending breakdowns. I've been collecting this for months, waiting for the right moment to speak up." He handed the folder to Morgan, who flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "This," Morgan said, holding up one page, "is why Emily was turned away. Not because of a lack of space or resources, but because priorities have been misplaced." His voice grew firmer. "This is about more than one girl. This is about who this library truly serves." The board member glanced at the papers, her face unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like nothing would change. But then, with a long breath, she addressed the room. "I'll be honest," she said, "this is a wake-up call. We've lost sight of our purpose. Starting now, we'll review these budgets and shift our priorities." The librarian's face turned crimson, and she opened her mouth to protest. But the board member cut her off. "And as for Emily," she said, looking at the girl, "you're welcome here any time. That's what this library is meant for." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the room. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she finally managed a small smile. But just as the tension eased, Morgan spoke again, his tone lighter but pointed. "One last thing," he said, turning to Emily. "What's the book you wanted to borrow?" Emily hesitated, then quietly replied, "A biography on you." The room erupted into laughter, the tension breaking completely. Morgan chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, let's get you that book," he said, leading her to the shelves. As the crowd began to disperse, the librarian quietly slipped away, her authority diminished. And while Emily left that day with her book in hand, she also carried something far more valuable, the knowledge that she wasn't alone, and that even in the darkest places, someone will step up to fight for what's right. As Emily walked out of the library with her book hugged tightly to her chest, the weight she had been carrying for so long seemed a little lighter. She glanced back through the glass doors and saw Morgan Freeman standing near the checkout desk, chatting warmly with the young staff member who had spoken up. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt something she hadn't in years: hope. The library, once just another place where she felt invisible, had transformed into a symbol of possibility. And it wasn't just for her. The whispers around town started almost immediately. About the budget changes. About how the library might now become more inclusive and accessible. And, of course, about the moment Morgan Freeman himself had taken a stand. In the days that followed, people began noticing small but meaningful shifts. A new community corner was set up for students, job seekers, and those looking for a safe place to learn. Emily became a regular visitor, slowly working her way through books that inspired her and fueled her dreams. Sometimes all it takes is one act of courage, one bold move, to change the course of someone's life. For Emily, that moment came when a stranger chose to see her not as a problem, but as a person.